Good evening, everyone. I'm excited to introduce to you our speaker for tonight. He is an instructor of behavioral sciences here at BHSU. He holds a Bachelor's of Science in Psychology and Sociology from the University of West Alabama and a Master's of Science in Experimental Social Psychology from Mississippi State University. Tonight, he will present the video game Monologues, an examination of gender in a male-dominant world. Please give a warm welcome to William Cockrell.
Hey everybody, it's great to be here, especially that for once in my life I can actually combine something my mother always told me to stop doing and what I should actually do more, which is study. So actually we are combining some type of academic research with video games, something we would never expect. Is there any way, how would we get this up here? So just to give you a little more background on what I'm interested in as a researcher is absolutely, I tend to fall back on social psychology a lot. And meaning it's hard for me to pick between, do I want to be a psychologist or do I want to be a sociologist? So sometimes I can always rely on social psychology to help me understand how the individual thinks, but also how they interact when they're in public, in groups. So as you see up here, there are a lot of things I'm interested in. A lot of it I've gained from my academic advisor, so interpersonal violence or media studies and the aggression. And we're starting to see that I like to link a lot of my research topics together. So as of right now, I have a master's, and I always tell my students that you can just call me Mr., because asking you to call me Master Cockrell just sounds creepy. So we tend to avoid that one. But I do want to eventually get my PhD. I'm not sure what field, probably social psychology or maybe even environmental psychology. But I still, at the end, want to publish some research with perhaps some governmental think tank, because largely that's where we can get the grants, at least as of right now. But let's look at a little more personal aspects. So as I said, I've played a lot of video games throughout my life. Largely when pressed, I'm going to be a Nintendo fanboy more so than anything. But this has changed. It's true, I've never had an Xbox system, but largely that's why I like to hear from you. And you tell me about your experiences, perhaps with Halo, or Call of Duty, or Grand Theft Auto. So those are some games that I don't commonly play. So another one that I always felt alone with was when everybody played Rock Band, and I just kind of watched. So meaning there are some things that I don't know a lot about, but we can also discuss this as a group. Another thing that I find interesting is there's been somewhat of a cross-intersection between two groups, people who play video games and people who I also identify as perhaps gay or lesbian. So I refer to myself as a gamer, a G-A-Y-M-A-R, and that is a gay man who plays video games. Sometimes there's this stereotype that gay men only like to go to the clubs. They always like to go to the gym. And that's not really who I am. And that, of course, can cause a disconnect. So whenever we can perhaps feel a little more accepted in our community, it's always helpful and beneficial. So to show you some of my cred here, this is actually my gamer tag for PlayStation. So I'm getting so close to 3,000 trophies. I'm really excited about that. But you could also look at that on Platinum. I only have 7 Platinum trophies, so there's a lot of room for improvement there, so to speak. Here's some of my favorite games, so maybe series instead of just an individual game. But I'm going to point out a lot of these and say that while they are classic, hallmark illustrations of how video games can be an art, there is a topic that we need to discuss, perhaps of how people are portrayed differently or unrealistically in this medium or platform of video games. I never had an Atari. They were still out when I was a little kid, but my father had the idea that Ataris would destroy your TV. So essentially I never got one. He would say that they would burn out the picture. And so for the most part, I've done a lot of reading on Ataris, but what we see, not a lot of humans. So meaning there isn't a massive focus on how we portray individuals, be it male or female. There absolutely were games back then that did have perhaps a female hero So there's one, I've never played it, but the major concept is a little character, maybe a 4-bit character, runs around and steals a key. And the premise is to get the key without being snatched up by a monster. And you can't tell by playing the game, but when you read the manual, you're actually controlling a little girl. So meaning, even in the earliest stages, we do see different depictions of men and women, but it might be related somewhat to graphics. Meaning, the better we can depict humans, that will be an argument of this lack of representation. So let's look at this last question that I have here. What is your goal in Super Mario's or The Legend of Zelda? What are you trying to do? Yes. So meaning you are playing a male and your job is to save a female that you can't play as. You merely watch. And you are right. So as we see, it's always been strange to me, look how much taller Peach is than Mario. And we see that even, maybe he's the mini Mario and he's lost a handful of lives, but we still see it's this thank you because I'm passive and just somewhat waiting around to be rescued. We can even have text with help up at the top when Daisy is asking for Mario to rescue her from Donkey Kong. So let's go to another generation. Let's look at the Super Nintendo and see how we're starting to see progression in the way that different people are presented. When we talk to an individual and they identify themselves as somebody that plays video games, let me show you an illustration. If any of you have watched South Park, there was an extremely negative and offensive depiction from multiple levels, dealing with the body, dealing with who people are as perhaps being a geek. And what we see is there was a very not so appropriate depiction in the World of Warcraft episodes. But have any of you heard of this man before? Francis. Francis is a man who gains a lot of money by posting videos on the internet where he screams about video games. He oftentimes throws consoles across the room, breaks TVs. So yet again, it's perhaps reinforcing this idea that people who play video games are adolescent or infantile, meaning they perhaps do all live in their mother's basement, maybe. So we see that when we think that is who the typical gamer is, that might be how video games become constructed. Meaning that if we expect all gamers to be 25-year-old men, we might expect them to all have somewhat similar expectations or taste. And this can be a dangerous idea. So some of the earliest ways that women were illustrated or depicted in video games, we do have to remember that there were graphical limitations. So meaning, oftentimes, perhaps a drawing in the manual was very different than the way they would look. Two different characters, so don't make that assumption, but maybe art and then the actual CG graphics couldn't match up in certain circumstances. But we've made that argument before, so we say, well, they're so tiny, they don't look that different. But when games are remade, typically women don't wear underwear outside of their pants, but yet we're looking and both of them are doing that. So we're still seeing sexualization, and we can't always use the argument it's due to a lack of technology. So Chun-Li is one of the characters that I use to perhaps model this presentation, in that whenever pressed in a fighting game, I pick female fighters first. And it took me a long time to actually notice that, but when we look at fighting games, what traits do the female fighters typically have? What makes... Yes. So meaning, when you compare Chun-Li to Blanca, or Ryu, or various other ones, we tend to see that in fighting games, males are stronger and slower. But the female characters are always very fast agile, but they have to hit the character a lot more to defeat them. And this is in essence still falling back on some of the traditional gendered expectations that we have. The other aspect is when we compare outfits, we tend to see that female characters in video games show a lot more skin than their male counterparts. So we're already noticing a visual. Even when words are not actually being expressed, just the symbols we perceive can denote differences. So, have any of you played Street Fighter before? So we have Cammy as well. And I really like Cammy. Cammy's cool. She is British, she's sassy, and as I said, she's a really fast character and does lots of cool acrobatic moves. But I remember the first time I saw Cammy win a battle, I was shocked. So think of her battle pose, and we'll actually watch it here very quickly. What did Cammy show off when she won? Her rear. Meaning that one of the original defining traits of Cammy was that she fought in a bathing suit. Can you imagine Ryu striking that pose when he wins a battle? Probably not. Meaning that we have different ideals of how we expect men or women to behave, and that one is not one that we would typically see in everyday life. There's another fighting game that I want to show you. This is one that was somewhat of a cult classic. Yet again, this is one reason why I would want an Xbox. There's a game that was called Killer Instinct. And finally, they made a remake a few years ago for the Xbox. And it was interesting. You bought the characters out of order. So instead of just getting the whole package, you could pick which ones you wanted to buy. But yet again, Orchid is my favorite character. A very fast, agile female character. But her fatality, the way she kills her opponent, has always been something that has been somewhat hard to swallow. We probably won't even be able to understand with these old SNES graphics, but just let's watch. Orchid causes a heart attack by blasting her opponent, meaning that she, for the most part, pulls her shirt open, and we saw the opponent die of a heart attack. Meaning, yet again, these are things that we saw a lot in the 1990s in video games. And we always said that perhaps we will progress, and these are things that won't be an issue. But I'm going to show you that while some things have progressed, some things are largely, we're noticing, taking longer to perhaps change or develop. So how would we perhaps tie this into the idea of any type of academic research? We've already went over this concept of how sexes could perhaps be treated differently. But let's look at these two hallmark terms that start out with how we go over any type of aspect of identity relating to these concepts. We have sex, which we oftentimes denote or tend to associate with biological characteristics or genetics. We have this term called biological determinism. This is the belief that everything we do is caused by our body. But it's a belief, not an actual reality across the board. So with sex, we tend to break it down into primary and secondary sex characteristics. A primary sex characteristic is largely something that we notice from birth, and it's related to reproduction. But a secondary sex characteristic, we see more variability. It is sometimes influenced more by cultural expectations. So meaning, as I have up here, facial hair. I actually just shaved this morning, and I notice a clear difference. When I'm freshly shaven, I have a much higher chance of somebody calling me ma'am, mistaking me for a woman, versus when I have a big old lumberjack beard. And that's simply just because of secondary characteristics. We use these to determine if a beard's there, this must be a man. Or if breasts are there, this must be a woman. And it is reliable, but not across the board. Have any of you heard of polycystic ovary syndrome before? So think of this, the acronym for this disease is POS. Isn't that the best descriptor for this disease? But what we see is women that sometimes have this in the most severe cases will actually grow a beard. When we look at perhaps men who go through andropause much later in life when they stop producing testosterone, sometimes those pecs will turn into breast. So while secondary sex characteristics are helpful, they are not across the board always going to tell you a person's sex perfectly. Well, let's look at gender. If we say sex could arguably be related to your body, to your biology, I oftentimes tell my students, gender's up here. Gender is your mind. It perhaps can be your behavior, character traits you hold. So meaning, without giving you any information, if somebody sits down and crosses their legs, so a leg over their knee, are we to assume this is feminine or masculine behavior? Feminine. If we see somebody that stands up and they're angry and they do this, feminine or masculine behavior? What about this? Yes, but that actually has nothing to do with our biology of this different body language. So we're already starting to see this overlap, and it can get very complicated in even teasing out these two concepts. The last term on here is one that's applicable to today, in that we oftentimes hear, using biological determinism again, what you're born with genetic-wise is what you should stick with. Well, this research is actually showing us not all people are going to fall under the first two. While it's rare, sometimes people are born with an XXY chromosome. These are always going to be men. And then XO is referencing a woman that has been diagnosed with Turner syndrome. Do any of you know what an O in genetic testing means? There isn't one. The absence. So this person's born with one sex chromosome. We're looking at about 1 in 5,000 people are going to be in this XXY or XO. So exceedingly rare, but we can't say that it's just the first two. The last one, intersex, you might have heard the original term. We used to use the term to refer to an individual with both or ambiguous genitalia as a hermaphrodite. Today it's more appropriate to use the term intersexed because largely this is just something that we now would argue has less stigma associated with the words. And also it's helping us group people that we normally wouldn't always lump together with that word. The reason I bring this up, of course, is what we're noticing is we're playing video games set in space. We're playing video games in the future with magic and various other ones. So when we start holding these very strict ideals in games of fantasy, is it necessary? Most gender theorists will sometimes make the argument that, well, with sex we have DNA, we have hormones, but with gender we see more variability, meaning how a man acts in the United States may not be how a man acts in India or in Zimbabwe or Australia. The same thing for a woman. So added on to that, how a woman acted in the 1700s may not be how a woman acts in the 2000s. So time and location is powerful. But even with that, it's hard, and sometimes we could argue even impossible, to put or place a numerical value on gender. Meaning that with sex, we could do something called dummy coding. A variable is 0 or a variable is 1. And then we can add it and perhaps perform a quantitative analysis. But with gender, what I'm trying to present you here is, how do we measure it? Could we measure everybody on one scale like the first one? Or would we have a different scale for men and a different scale for women? Or do we give everybody a masculinity score and everybody a femininity score? Regardless, what I'm getting at is there hasn't always been agreement. And that perhaps shouldn't be the focal point. Let's just go over how different people can perhaps express gender in various different ways. Who's played Metroid? So, for the longest time, I remember I heard people say that Metroid was a perhaps idol, which it's one strange to call a video game character an idol or somebody that you would want to, I guess, role model your life after. But let's get a little more information about Samus. The first time I played a Metroid game, it scared me. Very dark, lots of things just crawling in the background, sci-fi, industrial-like music. And you have to, for the most part, just run around and shoot aliens. So it's very different than Mario or Zelda, which is super bright and dealing with fantasy. So in Metroid, we were dealing with scientists creating weapons out of animals. And that, of course, is automatically a darker tone than some of the other games. But in the first Metroid, you get a surprise if you beat the game under, I can't remember, 3 or 4 hours. Do any of you know what I'm talking about? So when you beat the game in that time limit, you get the real ending of the game. And let's watch the real ending. And keep in mind, it's true. Samus could arguably be one of the first female video game characters, or heroes, playable characters in a Nintendo system or console. And this was back in the 1980s. Yes, it is hard to swallow the fact that the first time we see her, she is in her undies. The argument is, let's remember what Samus actually is wearing. So they try to say perhaps, well, she is in armor. You don't wear a dress under armor. So I can see it both ways, but yes, we can depict Samus in a much more positive way than perhaps how she originally was. But I know there was a long-running joke on YouTube where somebody voiced the character Master Chief. And he meets Samus. And he says, Samus is cool. He is a really kick-ass character. And then somebody says, Samus is a girl. And that, of course, shocks the Master Chief character. And this is related to the idea, if we expect the video game industry to be dominated by men, would it be too surprising to automatically make the assumption this person covered in body armor is a man instead of a woman? It's not a desirable outcome whatsoever, but it is a reflection of the industry that we're in. So meaning that it is not a stretch to say that the video game industry experiences the concept of patriarchy. When we look at men and women, stereotypically, who is a computer programmer? Men. When we look at all STEM fields, they are largely heavily represented by men. So that's our first step. But then, as I'm going to show you, the more we look at what is presented in video games, it's this concept of hypermasculinity. More so than just being a man, it's action hero men. It's Rambo, taking things to the extreme, so to speak, oftentimes in unhealthy ways. So let's look at this last bullet point. And this can help us understand the differences between sex and gender. If we get down to it biologically, Samus is a woman. But she rarely talks. She actually didn't talk for like the first 3 or 4 games whatsoever. She's always fighting, and she loves weapons, and she loves shooting things and being aggressive. That's not what we oftentimes associate with being feminine. So therefore, there is this discrepant or incongruent presentation of Samus. And sometimes that makes people uncomfortable, but I perceive it as an advantage. I perceive it as something that we should admire in this case. And that, for the most part, Samus is not like Princess Peach, which is, of course, the exact opposite, in that she is very feminine. And we oftentimes make skewed assumptions about that, so to speak. So meaning, when we see Princess Peach, and she's decked out in a puffy dress, and pink, and blonde hair, what's an assumption we make about her? Or, can she take care of herself? No. Meaning, what she's wearing, how she's presenting herself, we shouldn't actually make that assumption. She could have a weapon underneath her big poofy dress, and we wouldn't know. But we are still basing opinions off of these stereotypical pieces of information. I was very excited when this game called Metroid Other M came out, because I was told or saw in the previews that Samus was now not only going to be a first-person shooter, just your hand, but she was actually going to be doing a lot of cool, like, acrobatic stunts. I have this poster up on my wall because Samus just looks so cool doing this to me. But then they gave her a makeover, and Samus became this Samus. And what we see is different body language, a skin-tight outfit, blonde hair, and just essentially a polar opposite of this. And oddly enough, I was expecting the sales of this game to increase due to the softened image of Samus. But actually, the game tanked, so to speak. And that perhaps this is yet again a way that we can twist this in a positive way. We are starting to accept portrayals of tough women, but we're still not completely there. When I was in junior high, the PlayStation 1 came out, and the first game I got was Tomb Raider 2. And that was a very popular game. And I'm going to jump down a little bit because we, for the most part, all know who Lara Croft is. But let's look at this bullet point where I have heard gamers say, sexism isn't in video games, we have Lara. Now, if you grew up in the 80s, people love to say, racism doesn't exist, look at Michael Jackson. Or they would oftentimes say, sexism doesn't exist, Costa Rica's had a female president. So the tokenistic fallacy is the argument that when one person in a minority or less representative group succeeds, we say their differential treatment doesn't exist anymore. So meaning, people, of course, were making the argument, we now have a video game with a lead female player. We don't have to worry about this anymore. We have conquered sexism in the video game industry. And that, of course, is not a realistic approach to take. But the PlayStation 1 did have a large group of both positive and negative portrayals of video games. As I showed you up there, Final Fantasy VII is one of my favorite games. I'm very excited about the remake. And I've always liked Aerith because, one, she's not sexualized. She's pure. She's holy. But at the same time, she's yet again always needing to be rescued. She's physically weak, and she also doesn't like confrontation. So even though she's not sexualized like perhaps Jill Valentine right here or Lara Croft, it's still not the same treatment as we see male characters. So this game, Fear Effect, got a lot of media attention because it was one of the first video games to depict a lesbian relationship. But when you really get down to it, it's not a positive portrayal. It's kind of like the portrayal of I kissed a girl and I liked it, meaning it's not true lesbianism. Sometimes they call it faux lesbianism, meaning it's erotic attraction still for men. Right now the game I'm playing is actually Rise of the Tomb Raider. So oftentimes I feel a need to say that yes, where we started with Lara Croft, it was not the best intentions, but there's been a lot of progress. When we look at the progression of the model, we see that Lara was originally a Barbie. To be, full disclosure, Lara Croft was originally Larry Croft for the first 6 months of development. Late one night, when the developers were extremely tired, as a joke, said, what would Larry look like as a woman? And then, of course, they spent most of the night doing that, and then when the boss came in, he said, you know what, keep it. And then that's how Lara Croft was born. But you still have to remember, it was created due to oddity or absurdity, meaning they didn't expect that. But still, in the first few Tomb Raiders, she's pretty much like a Barbie doll. If she tried to walk, she would tip over. She is not realistically proportioned by any means. But what we're noticing, the further we get down, we notice that sex is becoming less of a focal point in how Lara Croft is portrayed. And now we're starting to see that, as I have up here, the emphasis is going to be more on, instead of Lara being sexy, it's more on Lara being a PhD or having a PhD in archaeology. Or what's really unique to me or interesting, when you look at the early Tomb Raiders, Lara never interacted with people. Now that makes sense. She's in caves, she's in tombs. But the newer games, there's a focus on Lara saving people. And it's getting a little more complicated than that. Lara is a woman saving men in most of the new games. And that would have been unheard of 10 years ago. So I absolutely see improvement in this, and I think we should expect a positive trend, hopefully for future Tomb Raider games. I can show you some other examples as well. Who's played, perhaps, any of these games up here? Have you played The Sims, Cooking Mama, Candy Crush? If you ever played any of those, oh, well, here's one that's getting a lot of attention right now. On the Apple Store, people are arguing that they should stop and curb the games of plastic surgery for children. And so the reason I'm bringing this up is because these girl games up here. This one is not the best description to use, meaning the statement is, if girls can't play real video games, they'll play Cooking Mama, or they'll play The Sims instead. And so what we're also noticing is, with these girl games, they're reinforcing gender roles. Meaning that we are not born with the large majority of the characteristics we hold or gain. We learn these through the roles that we are placed in. So if your whole life you have been spent learning how to operate in the kitchen, operate at home, you are going to develop and gain skills related to domesticity. If you are honed and raised or reared to be a business person, you are going to gain the characteristics of being aggressive or confrontational or competitive. But those aren't based on biology. They're based on various different forms of gender typing. So meaning, when you give a girl a toy set, what is that somewhat teaching her to do or encouraging her to do? What is she going to learn with the tea set? Is she going to learn how to build a railroad with it? No. Meaning the tea set somewhat kind of encourages you how to learn how to serve people or cook for people. But then if we give boys Legos and building blocks, that encourages them to create things. So this gender typing is something that we can see in children's toys as well as various video games that we are being exposed to. The last term I have up here is a hard one to discuss. And I do apologize that it is absolutely a controversial issue. But like any topic related to sexual assault, the more we ignore it, the more we brush it over, it tends to, of course, grow or become exacerbated. We have this term called rape culture. This is the statement that for some reason we're starting to see a relationship, a tie between violent behavior and expressing sex. And that seems ludicrous to us. But we do actually have depictions of it. And now, it's hard, because video games are violent. Most of them aren't today. So, when we try to make the statement that women receive excessive amounts of violence in this platform or media, we have to argue, well, everybody's getting shot. So how can we distinguish between who's getting harmed differently than others? So I think these three questions I have up here are pretty beneficial. So if you're playing a game, and if only women are getting harmed in the game, of course, that's a clear one. But if the mission requires you to harm a female character, or if you get points for harming the female character, or if you level up for harming an individual based on their sex, that, of course, is reinforcing this concept of a rape culture. The other aspect would be that many gender theorists would say that when we're dealing with sexual assault, it's not about sex in many of the circumstances. It's about power. It's about domination. It's showing you are in control of somebody. And that, of course, is not always directly linked to sex. But let's look at some of these depictions of violence against women in the electronic platform. Who's the man? Duke Nukem. So he hadn't had a game in forever. He had one, I think, in development for like 10 years, and they finally released it. But when we oftentimes look at all forms of ads, we tend to notice women are physically lower than men in many advertisements. And yet again, that's what we see here. So this is depicting Grand Theft Auto, and it's more than just sex in this one. We're starting to notice some racial stereotypes as well. So meaning when the woman, of course, this one is not as much about race, but she's being sexualized when she's being arrested. The middle one is reinforcing, of course, this thug stereotype of African Americans. And do any of you know the controversy of the third picture? Who? Yep. So Lindsay Lohan sued Grand Theft Auto and said, that picture looks like me. You need to give me some money. And I think she won, actually. But still, it's not a positive portrayal of many women. I've never played a Hitman game, but they released about 5 advertisements where all of the women were shot point blank in the middle of the forehead, but they were all placed in erotic poses. This is yet again linking violence and sex, things that we should not typically connect together. Dead Island got in a lot of controversy for their limited edition, which of course was just the torso of a woman. It was released in England, but was pulled in the American market. But what we still see, this is yet again perhaps us being too comfortable with the idea of violence and sexuality. So let's look to see what the industry has to say about this, who these people are. The survey says that 50, it's evenly split. So 50% of purchasers for video games are female, the other half male. But look at the top. The average age of the most frequent game purchaser is 35. What do you think is actually going on in this situation? Yes, meaning that they're actually measuring who literally is buying the product, and that's typically the parents. But what it does is it makes the gamer population look older, perhaps, than it actually is when they are using that assessment. So the average game player, they say, is 31. The number of female gamers age 50 and older increased by 32% from 2012 to 2013 in 1 year. So that means we are seeing a dramatic improvement of female representation of gamers, the people playing the games, not always the characters. We still see that by far action is the most preferred genre. When I gave this Geek Speak on campus, one of my good friends, who is a philosopher, made the argument, we can't remove violence from video games because we have to go all the way back to Homer. We have to go all the way back to the Odyssey, and we see a classic setup in all art is man versus man, or man versus nature. So arguably, yes, we do have to deal with the violent context in video games, but it perhaps is more than just this specific form of art. Another issue that we tend to see is when we look at the top-selling games for this particular year. I know this is hard for you to read, I apologize. But for consoles, how many of those have a playable female video game character? Which one? Okay, so when we look at one where it's not player creation, The Last of Us. That's the only one that actually has a female character that you play as. And do you play as her the whole game? No. So meaning what we're seeing is when we get to the games that are sold or bought the most, they have common characteristics. And it tends to be their rating, and then also perhaps how they get the rating. So the different aspects, so violent content, sexualization, language, etc. But while this is interesting, I want to show you who's actually signing off on this research. Electronic Arts, Konami, Level 5, Microsoft, Natsumi, Sega, Sony Corporate Entertainment America, Square Enix. This would essentially be similar to if we released a survey asking about lung cancer and R.J. Reynolds was the author of the survey, meaning that these people have a heavy bias in the publication that they released. So perhaps we need to look at independent, peer-reviewed empirical research, but it's hard to find. This is about the easiest thing you can acquire. But let's look at some progress. First off, to be a little sassy, we have to see that when we look at most video game characters, we have the white man with brown hair covered. We're good for the next decade for the most part, meaning this is the default, so to speak, of the title characters. But let's be more positive. All of these games that I have listed up here impressed me to an extent. Life is Strange was created by Square Enix. Have any of you heard of this game? It's got some critiques because you don't really play it as much as you just make choices. So sometimes they used to refer to these as interactive novels. But what's unique is you can actually choose the sexual orientation of the main character. You can decide if she enters a lesbian relationship or if she enters a heterosexual relationship. And that's the first time I've ever seen a game where that was even an option. But what also impressed me is it's real. The game wasn't talking about aliens or superhero powers. It was talking about being in high school. It was talking about bullying, about different forms of date rape, and various other concepts that are applicable to our everyday world. So I respected the game for that. But I'll give you another reason why I liked the game. Do any of you know perhaps what's below this picture of Chloe? Halfway through the game, Chloe has an accident, and she's presented for the rest of the game as a paraplegic, meaning that when we look at video games, Lara Croft is the peak of physical health. So is Nathan Drake. So are all of these other soldiers. So could you really imagine the idea of playing a video game where the character is in a wheelchair for the whole game? And I think that's an interesting idea. I would like to play that game. But the argument is the industry thinks nobody would buy that game. This summer when I got my PS4, I signed up for the PSN Plus. And I was surprised because that means every month you get a free video game. How awesome is that? The first one I got was Gone Home. This is the story, and it is more of a visual novel than it is a video game. But in it, a young girl feels compelled to leave home because she is dating a young woman. So she is in a lesbian relationship, and it's pertaining to how this is straining her family. When the game was released, it was portrayed as a horror. Everybody was under the assumption that this was a haunted house video game. So many gamers, when they uncovered that it's actually somewhat of a romance story, they were shocked. Some were okay with it, but others said they wanted their money back. So meaning we still have very different opinions. The Last of Us was an extremely successful game for PlayStation. The Last of Us depicts these two characters, Cole, I think is his name, and Ellie, living in a post-apocalyptic world. A disease has spread throughout the world and very few people are surviving. Ellie actually is immune to the disease. So throughout the game, we notice the relationship between these two, and it becomes a powerful bond. And while Ellie is portrayed in a positive light, she becomes very independent, self-secure about herself. It still falls back on this father-daughter relationship. And the end of the game pretty much winds up with the father making the determination that it's best if he holds the truth from Ellie. So he essentially lies to save her feelings. And to me, that still somewhat reinforces the aspect of women need to be protected. So while it's progress, it's not perfect. This game was a sleeper hit. Everybody's gone to the rapture. Yet again, another one of those free PSN games. The only thing that I have to say about it, and I feel like I can sum up how important it is in one sentence. In this video game, the main character is a woman who is also a physicist. Meaning that even in video games, that is just highly unlikely to happen. So we're seeing a video game where you are a woman studying nature, studying matter in various different aspects of the human world. And that, of course, is something that we've rarely ever noticed in the video game before. It's not all progress, though. I really like the Uncharted game, but since the first game, every time you beat it, you're given a new outfit. And that outfit's called Donut Drake. So as you would guess, it's the portrayal on the left, meaning Nathan Drake, who is normally in a lot of shape, is portrayed as an obese man. This is not necessary in a video game, and it is actually only reinforcing negative and skewed stereotypical opinions. So perhaps this is another depiction of, even if it's not gender, we do need to perhaps be a little more inclusive and understanding of different people in video games. Lastly, Child of Light was a positive impact on me because it combines both the idea of a young girl being the main character and also poetry. So I was impressed with it. It was both an intellectual, I guess, form of entertainment, as well as depicting a very rare illustration in electronic mediums. Have any of you perhaps played another more recent game that you were very impressed with the way either a woman or a man was perhaps presented? Or let's flip it. Have there been any that frustrated you and you thought were not appropriate? Do any of you play Overwatch? So I haven't played it, so you got to help me. But I heard that when the characters first came out, they had extremely sexualized armor. So meaning the girl armor concept. What does that mean? So, well, that's a good part of it. But the girl armor is... Go ahead.
Same stats Same protection, same points, and same stats as a normal male's outfit would be, but it has fallen under the skimpy outfit, where it's just like what many people would commonly say, the chainmail bikini.
Yes.
That's pretty much what the girl outfit is.
So as he brought up, it's the same stats, but when you really get down to it, would you go onto a battlefield wearing a bikini? Is that going to give you a lot of protection? Probably not. Go ahead.
Been playing For Honor.
Yes.
And you can hardly tell the differences between a male and female character in that game.
Correct. I've heard some good things about it. Is it still free to play, or do you have to buy it now? Okay. But I've played a game that I forgot to mention up here. It's a 3DS game called Bravely Default. And what it does is, I was surprised, because whenever we play RPGs, we typically relegate females to being mages. They cast magic, while the male characters use the swords. But in Bravely Default, a woman is actually going to have the original knight's job. So that was, I guess, a change similar to like what you saw. So we have noticed progress. A content analysis is something that both sociologists and psychologists use. So this is the goal of a researcher trying to review movies, paintings, books, diaries, etc., and trying to find recurring themes, similar statements, and they can either be coded numerically, or they can even just be a very large, important publication, book, etc. So, however you take it, there are multiple advantages to this research method. So, I'm just a little OCD, I'll say that, and that whenever I finish a book, whenever I finish a video game, whenever I finish an album, I write it down in a list. And then I date of when I finished that said particular item. So I have a list of all the video games I've ever played. Right now it's at 315 games. And so what I did was, I wanted to actually study the different video games I've completed and ask a few questions about them. So now, for any of you that have taken statistics, we have something called a normal distribution. On a piece of paper, how is that normally drawn? What do we call that? Yes, good, thank you. A bell-shaped curve. And this depicts this normal distribution. If you do not have the bell-shaped curve, we typically say this normal assumption, or this assumption of a normal distribution has been violated. You can continue your research, but you have to be a little more careful then, or you have to perhaps use other methods. So with that being said, what I'm about to show you cannot be, I guess, applied to the total population of video games. Meaning, it's not enough. I would need thousands of video games to comfortably say this is a reliable content analysis. But at least we can get our feet wet. We can see, at least with 300 video games, is there a trend? Of those 315 games, I saw that 50% of them, the video game character was a male. 14% of them, the video game character was a female. To clarify, with fighting games, I did not include them in the measurement, because typically in most of them you can now pick the difference between the two, but I can still include those in further questions. So you brought some of this up with custom, meaning I love the Dragon Age series. I love the Mass Effect series. I really love the Fallout series. And in all of those, you get to make a video game character. You play as the one you design. And what we're noticing, when women play a custom game like that, are they typically going to design a female or male character? What do we expect the males to do? Male or female character? That's what we expect. But the little research actually out there shows there is no estimation or expectation we can make. So meaning there are plenty of male gamers out there secretly playing as female characters online. And did you say sometimes not secretly? Yes, sometimes they're openly. Correct. So what we're seeing here is then maybe we are more comfortable than perhaps what Sony Computer Entertainment Arts or whatever association says we are. Now with multiple, that also could be where we could put in the fighting game characters. But sex of the rescuer. 33% of the time we're going to notice that men are rescuing somebody. I only had 7% of the actual 300 games where a woman was rescuing somebody. And then both would be probably mutual saving or protection. But sex of the hostage. We're seeing that, as I mentioned with Lara Croft, it's not until recently will Lara now save men. Originally, Lara only saved other women in video games. So we're starting to finally see that there's at least some gradual increase, or we're going to expect both, maybe. So with sexualization, I listed the questions that I asked. So I couldn't just say, yes, they were sexualized, or no, they weren't sexualized. In coding or content analysis, you have to think about it for a long time, and you have to perhaps insert qualifiers or these measurements. So as I said, if women were harmed in the absence of men being attacked, or if you were rewarded for harming the women, or if yet again they tended to prime violence and sex together, I would say if I answered yes to any of those three questions, I put them over here. And so it's hard to swallow, but we see that at least of the 300 video games sampled, 74% of the games had female characters sexualized. Have any of you played Devil May Cry? So Dante is a demon hunter, but Dante loves to rip his shirt off. Dante loves to take very sexualized poses. And sometimes people say that he is the trend we should take. Perhaps we should just say that why is sexualization so important or necessary in this medium? The last one that I measured was there a gay, lesbian, or bisexual character in the video game? And as you see, 94% of those 300 games did not, where about 4% did, and then 2% were implied. In the 1990s, Nintendo had something called the Family Values Code. And on the Super Nintendo, you weren't allowed to depict any type of amputation or same-sex affection. Those are two really different concepts, but those are the two that they said we can't have in video games. So we actually had requirements by the video game companies to not present any type of LGBTQ character. So it's just been in the past few years where we're actually seeing different discussions of sexuality. So you don't have to answer it out loud, but think about that. Do you imagine some of the most masculine and aggressive video game players out there would feel comfortable playing as a gay man or a lesbian woman? And now I'm saying that as in we shouldn't support that and excuse their behavior, but we are going to have to discuss this and say, what's your apprehensions? Why are you not comfortable doing so? And we need to change the approach. Any questions? Any comments? Here's one up here.
So, when it comes to the masculinity and femininity of characters, when it comes to the female characters taking Lara Croft's now latest look, when would you say excluding masculinity and femininity is better, or would you say that including both the feminine side and masculine side of female characters would be better?
Okay, I see. So you're saying that we should feel pressured into depicting them one way or the other.
Well, either or. Which one, by your own
They shouldn't feel
opinion?
any need to perhaps say, this is Lara Croft, therefore she must be sexy, but also caring. So meaning that we can have some gender discrepant behavior in video game. It would be okay if we had a Duke 'em Nukem character who did occasionally cry. wouldn't be a big deal. But in video games, that doesn't seem to be the portrayal. So I would encourage inclusion of both or all forms of gender expression.
So as far as strong female leads go, Song of the Deep carried a really good one for that. Just having a little girl find her dad. Did you find, I mean, I'm assuming you played it?
I have not played it. I saw a lot of advertising and did not even know that you were playing as a female.
Yep.
But isn't that somewhat of a reflection in this in itself? Meaning that sometimes when we see a video game, there's one that I played, it wasn't that great. It was called Remember Me. But essentially they tried to hide the fact you played as a female. So yet again, encouraging this belief that we would be uncomfortable. So Song of the Deep. I need to play that one. Any other recommendations? Here's one back here.
I just wanted to ask, in Fallout New Vegas, there was a gay character.
Yes,
but
arcade.
you had to speak to him very in-depth in order to find that out. It wasn't obvious just by looking at him or speaking to him superficially. But the Fallout series does also have basically a skill you can acquire where if you are a man, you can flirt with other men to get them to do things for you,
So is
and
it
vice versa
the
for women.
Lady Killer, and I don't remember the opposite.
Yeah, Lady Killer and then the other one. But it's not portrayed as your character necessarily being gay. It's more like they are taking advantage of maybe bisexual characters in the game and using them for their own personal gain. So do you think that that is a good thing for video games?
No, that would not be positive. We can't, of course, I guess, manipulate a person or say, well, hey, I need $50. I know this person's attracted to me. Let's benefit from that. That's not helpful. But when you bring up arcade, now I haven't played New Vegas in a while, so I don't really remember, but I was impressed with how arcade was portrayed. And in 4, I actually noticed that it's similar to Mass Effect, meaning with your companions, they're somewhat sex orientation neutral. So meaning that in Mass Effect, if you make a male character, it's up to you who you want to romance. They're not going to say some of these characters are just attracted to men or just attracted to women. And that's how Fallout 4 was. So I created a male character and was able to have the companion of dance. And it wasn't restricted just because dance is a male. So not the second part I was pleased with, but I do like the first representation.
First of all, I'd just like to say, Will, this is super fascinating. Thanks so much for presenting all this. I am someone who doesn't play any games, so this is new and super cool to me. What I wanted to ask you, as someone who deals with gender stuff as well, I'm fascinated by the representations you had up here, not only of hyper femininity, but of hyper masculinity. And I'm really curious. I don't know if it's more, I don't know, these masculine, feminine traits are more distilled, or what it is about the video game genre that seems to make it so condensed and obvious and overt. And maybe it's not. Maybe this is just my take from it. But I'm curious what that is, if it's the intended demographic, or it's just the form of how you play, or what it is that contributes to this.
Probably like many different circumstances, we can't restrict it to just one. But when you were describing it, without you even saying video games, I automatically thought of, well, this is starting to kind of sound like sports. Meaning that this is not the only medium where we have this, but yes, demographics seems to be a powerful outcome. It's always going to be reflected by the particular, I guess, point we are in a social zeitgeist or this cultural expectation. So when I say that Laura has become less sexualized, couldn't it also mean that we as a society have become less sexualized and she is somewhat of a, I guess, reflection of where we're at? Now also, I have no shame in this, but 2-3 weeks from now, me and Dr. Owen are going to have another Geek Speak lecture. April 2nd, is that right? 4th? 3 weeks. Oh, okay. So we will be giving another one. And it's basically about how to be a straight ally. And so that's going to be, I'm breathing heavy in the microphone, I'm sorry. April 24th at 6:30 p.m. So it's going to be me, Dr. Owen, a good friend, Terry Bruce, and then Dr. Amelia Flint. So that's one you should mark on your calendars as well. Go ahead.
We often hear that our society is becoming violent and represents sexualization and whatever due to youth being exposed to this violence and sexual behavior in movies and video games. So leading on to what you were just talking about, who's leading who? Is this a reflection? Is the video game a reflection of where we truly are at and we are progressing, as you say? Or are we being taken advantage of, where people are capitalizing on our weaknesses,
Are we being sheep?
thereby, through that exploitation, then magnifying the evil in us as well? Or do the manufacturers simply believe this is what they want to do?
We have something we call circular tautology, which means sometimes we get caught up in the cyclical pattern of events, and we can't really break them apart. So meaning we oftentimes go over this with concepts of child abuse, and we start seeing, well, the behaviors that initially started this are now encouraging them to continue. So it could have been either one of the outcomes you mentioned, and now they're feeding off of each other. So we can almost view it as a symbiotic relationship, meaning that as long as game sales are going well, probably the industry doesn't think, do I need to change anything? But when we see sales drop, that's when perhaps either they can become much more restricted in any gender ideas, or they can actually become a little more creative. So there's perhaps, I guess, flexibility in this. Very good question. Didn't you have one?
So we mentioned before that there's a lot more males playing as females, not really as a secret.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of times guys would come up and be like, yeah, I'm playing as this female because I can customize the character with the least amount of clothes as possible.
So they can observe her, look at her, I guess.
Exactly. So do you think that males are playing more as female characters because of the highly customizable options, or because of the agility and the different attributes the females can do versus the males?
It could be a little bit of all of them. I would have to say we probably should laugh at them if they are literally creating digital female counterparts. It would probably be more beneficial just to interact with women in real life. But regardless, But that's unique because I actually don't play MMORPGs. I don't really play online games, and they are dramatically different in their experiences. So perhaps I would have to say with the character, because when you play WoW, you do somewhat become your character. You define yourself as them when you play the game. So there are some aspects of identity as well with this.
I guess just to add on to that comment as well as I had another question. But I just know, personally as a gay male, I know a lot of times in video games I have to play as female characters because the only romance options between the main character and another man was with the female character. So I think there is definitely, especially with the gamer community, I think you definitely saw a lot more men that were in the closet and never had that ability, I would say, especially here in the Midwest, to really, I wouldn't say act on their sexuality, but they have an opportunity to actually play out and actually be that sexuality without kind of that condemnation that you see in
If you are
general
horrified
society.
of admitting to anybody that you are a gay man or a gay woman, maybe it's a little more comfortable to experience it in a video game first before you have to worry about maybe getting harassed or beat up in real life. Added on to what Catherine brought up in relation to this, she can model her jacket. She has an N7 jacket on, which is related to the video game series Mass Effect. And as he mentioned in the first Mass Effect game, my player character I made as a woman, just because I wanted to have a boyfriend in the video game. I wanted to have that option. But Mass Effect 2 and 3, as I said, that's not a restriction anymore. So I hope we continue to see that behavior because it would be more inclusive for everybody. Meaning, when I have created video game characters in these online custom things, I've made a heterosexual character, so I don't think it would be a stretch for a straight person to play as a gay character.
And then my actual question, I guess, relates kind of more on the trend of, I guess, race and racism within the games. Because I just from what I've seen, and admittedly I don't play a lot of games, my main platforms I would say are PS4, the Nintendo 64, and then PC. Even when you have, I guess, more diversity, you could say, it's very often focused on white.
Yes.
Like, even when you see lesbian couples, or even, for example, in one of the Assassin's Creed, you actually saw a trans-masculine character represented. They were still white. And so I guess my question is that really related to, and I apologize, I didn't get a chance to read through all the demographics. Was there a racial demographic breakup of players, or?
This is focused on just gender and biological sex, but you are absolutely right. There's an issue of perhaps race. So meaning we could look at that picture I showed of Grand Theft Auto. And what we noticed there was the black man in the white tank top, and he had the Rottweiler, who we are to assume he's probably fighting or something. But meaning, when you really start doing a coding analysis such as this, we tend to see the hero is white and the villains have dark skin. The first time this was brought up largely explicitly was during Resident Evil 5, which was set in Africa. So meaning the main character is white and all of the zombies are black Africans. And this, of course, was the first time we ever debated the idea of race in video games, which is interesting because we have some video games such as Mass Effect where we're literally debating the rights of fake characters, so alien species, etc. But that still at least demonstrates that we now understand in this platform these are issues we should discuss. So I would love to continue and, I guess, broaden on the idea of race and colorism in this field as well.
I'd just like to add another video game that has a girl main character, Recore.
I haven't heard of that. What console is it on?
Xbox.
Oh, okay.
One.
So Recore?
And they did keep her in the advertisements.
Oh, okay.
So,
another game I've heard about is Gravity Rush. Apparently a lot of people have liked that, and it's a lead female character. So I guess I should have said it, but I lost my coding analysis when I did this a year ago. So meaning, if I ever did this again, I would probably recruit students from BHSU and ask them to help me with the content analysis. So this could perhaps be something that I could get published with the help of other students.
I don't know if you remember this game from the early 2000s, but Dead or Alive was a game back then. They made a game called Dead or Alive Beach Volleyball. And you can imagine what that's like. It fits perfectly with what you're
So
talking
Dead or
about.
Alive is a fun fighting game. It is very complex. But one of the options in Dead or Alive is it is going to ask you your age. If you are under 18, the video game character's breast will not move. If you are over 18, the video game character's breast will move a lot during the fighting game. Meaning that, as in the early 2000s, there were still blatant depictions of sexuality. I never played the volleyball game, but essentially you played volleyball, earned points, and bought them presents, which they would then either throw back in your face or light you. Yep. So, yet again, somewhat reinforcing this idea of a sexual script.
Yep. Yeah, and then right now I'm playing Breath of the Wild, Zelda, and the Gerudos are a all-female fighting group that they've been in a lot of the Zeldas, but this one, you have to dress up as a woman, as Link, in order to get into their thing.
Linklet. Have any of you heard of the concept of Linklet? We originally thought that when the new Zelda came out, people thought that Link was actually going to be portrayed as a woman, and it shocked a lot of people. So then in one of the either Smash Brothers or Hyrule Warriors, they made a costume swap where it was actually Link as a woman. So, yet again, progress for Nintendo.
But the funny thing is, even though the Gerudo women are tough in fighting, in Breath of the Wild, they go to school to learn how to attract men and please men. So
We still have plenty of flaws.
So I'm going to delve a little bit into the indies now. So I want to talk a little bit about the main characters of Binding of Isaac and also Undertale. With Binding of Isaac having Isaac struggling with religion and sexuality and gender, and then with the violence concept with Undertale, whether to befriend everyone or whether to kill everyone. I was wondering, do you think that those concepts, where it's the inner struggle of sexuality, inner struggle of gender, and inner struggle of violence, do you think you'll expect to see that in actual AAA games, and how do you think it would probably come to be?
I would not have any
sociology?
issue. I honestly do not expect to see as much of the debate of a person perhaps questioning their sexuality in a video game. It would be great if we saw it. But the other one, I've actually heard, so I've never played it, but Borderlands and Far Cry apparently both depict this issue of violence. And as we see, going back to the example I provided, video games don't have to always be violent. People loved Rock Band, and nobody was particularly shooting or blowing each other up in that video game. So everybody loves the Candy Crush game, yet again not violent. So the issue is we just have to be more creative when it comes to all these video games where the goal is maybe forming a friendship instead of killing a person. And that sounds silly, but that yet again is a reflection of perhaps where we're at right now in society. So it's always going to start with the indie games, and then they will influence the mainstream.
Okay, so I have a question. My question is, you had stated that women aren't really in STEM as much as men. How do we appeal to girls and women to become video game developers?
Okay, so there's a company called Goldie Blocks. Have any of you heard of it before? I show some of my students that you've taken my classes. Goldie Blocks is a toy company geared towards giving girls chemistry sets, giving girls Lego blocks. Meaning when I went over the gender typing, if we give girls toys that encourage them to learn science, we're automatically starting to see a slow increase. So meaning in the next 20 years, we somewhat expect to see more women getting STEM degrees than men. But there's still a big difference between getting the degree and then getting the job. So we're starting to see dramatic improvement, but they still have a lot to fight for.
So I have a question, and it kind of goes back to what this gentleman was discussing earlier. I'm going to kind of ask you to forecast or predict about the future. Society's changing. Women are now allowed in combat arms in the military. So do you think games like Call of Duty, where the target demographic it's kind of unspoken, but it's more of like the middle school boy or the young high school boy, do you think they're going to, even if it's non-playable characters, incorporate female roles into the game, or are we probably not going to see it just because the consumer base isn't there?
Well, hopefully, we can get to a point where people constantly bombard Twitter or Facebook and say, I'm tired of playing as the male brunettes. And if the industry hears that enough, they will be pressured. So some of it is we do have to be proactive in the aspect. But I'm glad you brought that up. I discussed this in my class. We still don't really know that in the United States. It wasn't until 2014 when women can now serve in the front lines in the military. There are other countries that have had this ability for a long time. So meaning if we see more women enrolling in the military and being visible in the front lines, we might have a Call of Duty character that is a woman. Wasn't one of the Far Cries, the last one had a female character for the first time, I think. So we're already starting to see it. Good question. I truly do appreciate all of you coming out.